Alrighty. So it is just about 3 o'clock. So we will go ahead and get started. First of all, thank you everyone for joining us today. We're really excited for today's capacity building webinar. We will be focusing on the legacy of Dr. King and how we can work on leading actively anti-racist, service projects. In a little bit, we will be turning the microphone over to Vita Stovall from Campus Compact of Virginia. But I do want to touch on a few things as we get started. Just as a reminder, we will be recording this webinar and sharing it out afterwards. We do have the chat box available. If you do have any questions, please feel free to share any thoughts, questions, what have you, in the chat box. And with that, we will go ahead and get started. So first and foremost, we want to give a massive shout out and thank you to the Allstate Foundation. The Allstate Foundation, we absolutely have loved working with their team. So the Allstate Foundation, as many of you now know, are the primary sponsors of MLK Day 2021 and the funding for the grant that you are all engaged with. So the Allstate Foundation's Youth Empowerment Initiative supports in-school and after-school programs to provide young people with the critical social and emotional learning skills needed to succeed. And today we have two of their representatives joining us, Laura Frevaletti and Brianna Morris. Ladies, we're very excited that both of you are able to join us today. And again, thank you so much for all of your support. I do want to go ahead and ask Karen from Team YSA to hop on. One of the big things we've been working on recently is a resource regarding anti-racist service projects. Karen has been the leading force behind that, so I'm going to ask her to go ahead and share a little bit more about this initiative.
Sure, thanks Katie, and hi everyone, great to see you. Before I do, Brianna and Laura, thank you again for being with us, and would you like to say hi to the group?
Sure. I won't take up too much time. I just wanted to share our excitement for the upcoming MLK Day of Service. We are so excited about it and so excited to support you all and support youth and give them a chance to participate in these service projects. So thank you.
Thank you. So as Katie said, I wanted to just give a quick bit of context in terms of how YSA is thinking about this session today. This summer, after the murder of George Floyd, YSA started thinking about how we could contribute to the national conversation around racism in a meaningful way. And it made sense to us to start with our area of expertise, which is around youth engagement and service projects. And so we thought, if you think about a service project as really a social intervention in a community, then every service project can be an anti-racist project and should be. And that's what we'll be talking about today. So we wanted to put together a starting resource to help groups think about this. And we collected ideas around kind of each stage of the service project planning process to think about as project organizers. We also drew together a lot of resources from our partners and other organizations that are leading thinkers in this field. And you can find that at ysa.org/anti-racist. But we also didn't want it to be a one-stop point in the conversation. We wanted it to be a continued dialogue that we could bring to the field and help contribute to. So when the Allstate Foundation made this training possible, we were so excited, and the first person that we thought of that we hoped could lead the session was Dr. Vita Stovall. And so when she said yes, we were so excited, and she will be leading the rest of our time today. Vita is the director of Campus Compact of Virginia, and she also spent about 10 years, I think, Vita, as the executive director of Excel Youth Zone in California. And they were a lead agency for Global Youth Service Day back a long time ago. So she knows YSA well, she knows this program well, and she brings just a wealth of expertise around many of the topics that we'll be talking about today. So without further ado, let me thank again Tavita and turn it over to you. Katie, is that okay? You don't have anything else? Okay, great. Tavita, we'll let you take it away.
You're all set.
All right, thank you. I am going to try to share my screen with you. And as you can imagine, we have a lot to cover today. And I want everybody to understand that, sorry about that. As we, hold on. As we move forward, and I might have to leave my slides on like this, just because I know there's a little bit of a hiccup with technology right now, but hopefully you can bear with me. So just a little quick addition to my introduction. I was the director of Campus Compact for Virginia, and we recently did a reorganization, and now I am the national director for student, civic, and community engagement at Campus Compact. But I'm here in the capacity as also a business owner who's a consultant around education and equity issues through my organization, Griffin Legacy. So I want to make sure everyone knows that, so I don't get in trouble at work for representing them and not representing them. So a really quick overview of our agenda today. Can everybody see the screen? I just want to make sure they can see the slides. Great. So we're going to go through, we have a very quick hour ahead and a little short hour, but I wanted to take what YSA is doing, which I think is fantastic, and it can serve as a model for different organizations across the country on how to engage in embedding anti-racism in all the work that we do to serve the community. So we're going to do a really quick thing on introductions, and we'll probably just kind of go through that while I keep going forward. We're going to do a few things about a general agreement, agreements that we're going to have. We're going to talk about just quickly the goal of lead agencies, do a little word cloud. We're going to talk about what is anti-racism, maybe some working definitions and why this is tied specifically to the MLK Day of Service, but it is also part of what we need to be doing in every service project we do moving forward, and how we can embed those steps of anti-racism. And then we're going to do a reflection. If you had a chance, I hope, to read the Paul Gorski article that was shared. We're going to do a little bit of an activity online to kind of find out what we learned and what we still need moving forward. So as you can imagine, in our short time, we're not going to get to the heavy lift. We are just kind of, think of us as like looking across the land and saying, this is something I can try to embed now. So first of all, I like to do a land acknowledgement at the beginning of presentations because we owe this land to a group of people. And if we are doing anti-racism work, everything is about the land of the original people of this land. And so I want to give you a little bit of a sample if you're not used to this. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I gather with you today, is the traditional and unceded territory of the Nakotank Indians and the Piscataway Indians. And I put up there an app called Native Land. So should you like to find out what tribes are in your area, that is something you can utilize. While we're at it, I know many of you were trying to change your names, but we can also do in the chat Please let us know what city and organizations you are from and what gives you inspiration in these winter months. So we're going to do that and keep moving forward. Okay, I want to know, how are these hearts coming up on my screen? I have never seen that before. Okay, we're going to move forward. Somebody can answer that for me. So I also like to do general agreements, and if we were doing a full training and workshop, I would have all of us participate in what that would look like. But I usually come up with a basic set. So we're going to use I statements if we have a chance for a conversation. We will ask questions for clarification to avoid making assumptions. We balance participation in speaking and listening. And if we're talking about anti-racism work, this is the big one for me. Devil's advocate is not allowed. We speak from our true perspectives, and we are all present. I really need to know where these hearts are coming from. Does anybody know what's happening here?
So if you don't mind me interrupting you,
Go for it.
so people can use the annotate feature. So when you go to view options, you can scroll down to annotate, and then people can draw on the screen. So that is what's happening. I don't know if this person is aware that they are doing it or they don't know that it's happening, but that's what's happening.
I am working on it right now.
Thank you.
Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. I just like, I've never seen that before. So a little disclaimer, this when we do anti-racism work, this is an ongoing process. Nothing we talk about today is even going to begin to touch on what we need to do. Anti-racism work needs to be embedded in all aspects of what we are doing in our work. We have to start from the micro to the macro of sorry, it was a little distracting. Of the work. Anti-racism work needs to be addressing systemic racism as well. It's not just individuals, but also systems. And anti-racism work needs to be thought of as a movement, and a movement that has been taking place long before 2020. And many of the statements that have been made by organizations and different entities. So know that anti-racism work has a long history, and hopefully we can keep the energy in the movement for systemic change. So just really quickly.
Can I make a suggestion?
Yes,
I'm just thinking that, Katie, if you have host ability override. So I think if you override the ability of everybody to share screens, then what will happen is Ms. Dovia will be the only one who should be able to access additions. Because right now I think we've got input happening.
Tavita, can you give me the host permissions again? I'm so sorry. I will.
And sorry about that. I didn't mean to interject. I just
that's
appreciate
very helpful.
I'm so sorry about this, everyone.
That's okay. If I agree. Somebody said if you unshare it, like stop, unshare, and try it again, then it should work.
Hold on, let me do
my
this.
students do this from time to time.
Hold on, we're going to make this work.
There we go.
All right, so am I the only one who can share now?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to find my document again because I have to open it. And I will get everybody back on there. And what I do love and appreciate about Sorry. It has jumped away from me. It's coming back. It's a little slow. All right, I think we're going to get this. All right.
There we
We're
go.
back. Thanks everyone for, and I'm not sure who was the helpful person, but thank you. So really quickly, just a little overview of what YSA talks about for lead agencies. Lead agencies are responsible for convening partner coalitions to activate youth volunteers with a focus on engaging youth in middle and high schools and youth from underserved communities. And one of the things I thought was really important about this is that when you start to think of forming anti-racist practices within this work as a lead agency or within your organization, you are going to be taking this to a different level, a higher level of involvement, and infusing and embedding the voices of the communities and the coalition partners that you're working with. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a little Menti poll. I don't know if anybody's ever done Menti. You can actually use your phones to do this. You don't have to download any app or anything. You can use your camera to use the QR code, or you can go to menti.com. You can do it on your computer as well. And this is the code you'll plug into. And you can, I want you to just take a few moments and think about when you hear or think about anti-racism, which words come to mind? And if we're lucky, I'm going to try to share the screen with you of the website, but let's see. Anybody, if anybody has any issues getting in, let me know. So as I'm going to switch over to this really quickly. And as people are putting in your words, just you're going to see a little bit of what people are thinking. So we'll only take about a minute to do that. And I think I set it up so you can put in as many words as you can, 3 at a time. So some great words coming up here. As you are probably very familiar with word clouds, the more often you see, the larger the word you see, the more times it's been entered. So we've got listening, respect, empowerment, difficult, and justice are some of the main ones. We've got what a wonderful array of other words too: structural changes, uncomfortable, differences, privilege, dismantling whiteness, decentering whiteness, power, equitable. So I'm going to go back to my other screen, but y'all can still utilize that over time. And I just wanted to get people to start thinking about what anti-racism means. So anti-racism has many different definitions. And so I picked out a few of my favorites in the field right now. Racial Equity Toolkit defines anti-racism as the work actively opposing racism by advocating for changes in political, economic, and social life. Dr. Robert Patterson from Georgetown University says anti-racism is an active and conscious effort to work against multidimensional aspects of racism. And probably the most talked about definition around racism today is Dr. Ibrahim Kendi's work. And he says, it is not enough to be not a racist, you must be anti-racist. And there is no room for neutrality, and there is no such thing as a non-racist. Last year, he gave a lot of lectures, especially around Dr. King's birthday, around the history of the anti-racist work of Dr. King, and that it wasn't just about, some of the sound bites we often use and hear.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm good. I'm just gonna listen. I got you.
Looking at not only equity issues, but how do we look at resources? And that's why Dr. King's life, actually, towards the end, he was working on the Poor People's Campaign, because he looked at not only racial equity, but economic development, and looking at systems and institutional systems which held back Black people and people of color from achieving equity. And what were those mechanisms, those racist mechanisms in history that allowed that to occur. So one of the things I did with YSA has their wonderful project. They have guiding questions that they have created, and I'm sure all of you have had a chance to look at them. But if not, I'm just putting them here. We're not going to go through each one, but I did want to kind of give you a little bit of a snapshot of how they set it up around, our wonderful IPARD practices, which is so part of, like, it's ingrained in my brain. I feel like I should have a tattoo of IPARD somewhere, because it's been part of my life for over 20 some years. But what I do love are these wonderful guiding questions to help you kind of ask yourself in your work and in the processes that you're doing for your service projects, are we addressing some of these issues? Are we involving the groups that are at the table and stakeholders in an equitable way that really honor history, racial context, and help us move forward to actually actualizing an anti-racist practice? And so these are the questions that YSA has put together. And what I wanted to do today is to really kind of hone those down into 3 buckets that you can take with you today and maybe do some type of implementation on your projects, if you haven't already, for the upcoming King holiday, and then also build on that for future projects throughout this year and beyond. So what I kind of did is put it in buckets of process, practice, and perform. And there's a little asterisk on perform, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But when we talk about process, what's really important when we're talking about anti-racism work is that we have to be willing to face truth of what our organizations and communities think about the work we have done around race issues. So we need to kind of have a truth telling, a truth assessment, and then we also have to find ways that we can build trust. And so 3 major ways is taking inventory scaling the process. And right now, because we're talking about, if we're talking about MLK Day, we're a month out for a minute. And so you're going to need to not try to now recreate everything or leave everything out because of time. You want to scale the process of the work of anti-racism for the project that's maybe coming up right in the near future. And then talking about decision making. So some of these are just kind of looking at ways you can embed now, and we're going to hopefully build over the future to make the anti-racist work more sustainable and more pronounced. And so in the process, I look, some of these are like, as IPART is, you have a lot of things that kind of feed into one another. So that process of truth and trust, we should see it in investigation, preparation, reflection. We have practice, which are the dreams of all the stakeholders and the dissents of all the stakeholders. What are expectations that groups might have? How are we setting agendas of the project? Who has access to these decision-making and these expectations and agenda? And then how do we keep each other accountable in groups, especially around making sure that we are not creating, and we'll talk about harm reduction a little bit later, but how do we keep accountable that the work we are truly doing is anti-racist? And there are oftentimes, I can give you some really great examples and of times when I've done MLK Days of Service, which I've done for an entire university a couple of times, and sometimes for an organization where we are not really doing the actual work of anti-racism, but we are just kind of trying to get the day done. So one of the things I'm going to show you some of the things we can do to kind of help with that in the short term for now. And then we have perform, which is power and promises. We want communities to create racial equity sample goals and indicators of outcome. So we can talk from our organizations on our own about what should be the goal of this project, what should be the outcomes, but if we are not including the people who are either the target of that project or and in a substantive way, and if we're not including them in the development of those and how that process is going to go, we are not creating anti-racist spaces in those projects. And then we also want to have joint ownership of the stories and the products of that partnership as time moves on. So we can look at action, reflection, and demonstration and celebration around them. I want to make sure I'm seeing this. I want to make sure I'm looking at the chat really quickly to make sure I'm not missing anything. So there's something that probably looks familiar to you all, and that's research. And this is no different than you would do in any service project. But then you can think about this when you're doing an anti-racist lens. You would be looking at a whole host of research methods that you would want to do, like speaking to people, what is existing information, surveys, interviews, meetings, facilitating workshops. We know when we do service projects and we do it through the IPAR method, that preparation part, that investigation part is the part that we spend most of our time in. And that is no different when you're doing anti-racism work, because if you can set it up at the beginning and really have those voices and the information, you are going to be able to have a lot more success and not just buy-in. We want to have true partnerships and collaborations and coalitions moving forward. So one of the things when we talk about process, there's a wonderful tool called the Racial Equity Plan template. And I wanted to give you an example of how they kind of put together a rubric to kind of help you do a little bit of an assessment. So what has your organization? And before we kind of go out into communities and say, hey, we want to do this with you, and we need you to tell us if we're good or bad or not. You want to do some processes within your own organization to kind of take the temperature of, are you ready to really work and launch, and who is going to support that anti-racist work in your organization. So I love this tool. It's actually out of the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. So the couple of questions: what has your organization done to address its internal and historical racist impact? And what have you and individuals involved done to address racial bias within the organization? So this is just kind of like something you can have a conversation about before you even launch the conversation with stakeholders who you want to bring into for an anti-racist lens. So I love this because it has like, what is the community indicator? It asks, and jurisdiction, and this is just because it's government, but this could be participants. What are their understand, and are they committed to achieving racial equity? You can have all the great intentions in the world, but if you have people who are like, oh, I never even thought about racial equity, we don't have a problem here. You're at a different place than someone who is, has thought, an organization that has thought about, wow, we really need to do something about our racial equity and inclusion work and how we're going to structure it. So you need to do a little bit of an assessment of where you are and take that temperature. So we have community indicators. What are the outcomes? And this is just a nice example of how you can do your own setup of a rubric to kind of assess where your organization might lie. The second thing you could want to do is what are participants' view of your organization as an effective and inclusive entity? So you can do your own internal process, but what do people who are outside of your organization think about your organization's racial equity work? Because that is also going to inform how you move forward in your projects that you will be doing. And so for here, I like this. It's like, what are the percent of the population that believe the organization's values and community participation and engagement, are racially inclusive, and have you done outreach? This is something that has already been part of the organization, or is this the first time you're going to be taking on this challenge? The third part of this rubric is community, looking at an organization, the communities of color, and thinking about what is the economic prosperity, but it could also be when you talk about what is the thing your project is trying to address, what are the historical and current situation that impacts race? So for instance, I work with a group that is looking at food insecurity in a rural town. And, we could talk about rural, we could talk about, it being, more commercial farms are in that area, but there's also been a historical racial divide where in those commercial farms, the majority of the people working on the line were communities of color, mostly Black and Latinx, but then they did not have access in that area to the very foods that they helped produce in that commercial line. So that has had a long-term impact on food insecurity in that area. And so looking at how those historical and current contexts play into food insecurity can help inform your project as you move forward. And then there could be a whole host of other factors that you might want to look at. What is the criminal justice system? How is that impacting the community that you are working with or the community that you're from? What is your organization's connection to that? Education, housing, health, so a host of other things. So I'm going to take a moment and answer any questions so far, just kind of see how people are doing, and then we'll move on. Opening up. Okay, so we'll go forward. All right. So this tool is from, I believe it's Dismantling Racism, and it looks at ways you can practice another rubric. And I love rubrics because it gives you kind of an idea of not all or nothing, but a progression of where you might want to get to. So you're not feeling like, oh, we're just we're not doing anything. You might be somewhere in the middle. You might have a polka dot of approaches that are like high, great practices, and some that you're like, ooh, we really need to kind of think about this. And I love this one because it really talks about some of those things when we're looking at doing the action part of our projects that we want to kind of think about in how we can make sure it is more of an anti-racist approach. So we have decision making, on the low end, you might have only white people, and often men, who are making those decisions. They're made in private ways that people can't see or really know. And and those are not just about an organization big, but it's also about something like a service project that we would do with youth. If youth feel like, oh, somebody is making, and it could be even a teacher who is making all the decision, and then the students who might be, whether it's multiracial or all of color, aren't part of that decision making, then it might not be the best process of decision making. And here, there's some, markers of what isn't more of an anti-racist approach in decision making. It's made by a diverse group of people. There's significant leadership of the communities of color. Everyone in the organization understands how power is distributed and how decisions are made. And that's really important. Power is such a big part of when we talk about anti-racism work. That's a whole training in and of itself, but we'll get to a little bit of that.
Dr. Stova, can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
So, and I could put it in the chat, but I really like this chart because it really helps in a reflective process to go through and look at, as you say, where are the decisions being made? Are they all white, male? And I'm in rural Montana, so there's some demographic issues there to begin with.
Yes.
However, one of the things that I have found really struggling in looking at this, because particularly with the youth voice, we really try and focus on youth coming up with the decisions and all of those pieces.
Absolutely.
But in the Zoom platform, we're frequently faced with, as we are right now, even just looking at this platform we're on here, of just names. And so we don't necessarily have an indicator looking at from a non-self-reportive. So this is a, our lens in, looking at who indeed is making the comment. And many times, I'm working with students in multiple school settings, and we've got sort of this large classroom. So it's even more diffused. Do you have any suggestions on how to help students in particular identify and champion those differences. I am very well versed in how to do that in a disability setting, you know, to help a student recognize being dyslexic can be a huge benefit, and here's how you use it, and here's how you can help share it with others. But from a ethnic and racial perspective, do you have suggestions on how to do that, how to bring out that dialogue?
Yes, well, and that's, you hit that last word is perfect. It's dialogue. And there are actual toolkits on how to do dialogue around issues around race. And it's, you know, some are very structured, but that can actually be such a great platform. There's a couple of, there's one organization that's new to me, and and I actually do dialogue work a lot. So there's some platforms that actually help where you can start off with different groups. And this doesn't even have to be about race. It could be about political ideology around an issue, but where people can actually have dialogues first with within their groups and like groups, and then come together. And so it's a guided practice. And there's some great, if you go to racial equity toolkits, there's some dialogue toolkits on race and equity that actually help you host conversations with youth around racial issues. And it's very guided. So it tells you, you know, how do you address this, you know, how do you address somebody who, first of all, how do you set up ground rules? How do you set up, you know, what is, you know, how people get to speak in turn, what happens if there's a big conflict? How do you teach active listening? So there are some tools around that, and trainings. I've done those trainings. I love them. Oh yeah, somebody put it in the chat. This is great. Political Healers is one resource. So I have not heard of them. I would love to check that one out. But that's what I would say. And I think you hit it on the nose. It's that dialogue, but it's actually really guided dialogue, not just like, oh, let's have a conversation, but some guided dialogues. Does that answer your question, Wendy?
Yes, that does. That gives some good information and tools I can use. Thank you.
Sure. So I'm going to go through a couple of these really quickly. This is a little bit more, and let me just tell you this, because we only have 15 more minutes left. I want to make sure that Katie's going to get the slide deck. So you'll be able to have this. This also has a little bit more of that chart around power, around location. Oh, and let me go back really quick. One of the things I love is the talk about budget, because oftentimes in projects, you know, it's like, oh, you know, we've decided here's how the money is going to be spent, which, you know, sometimes everything's very restricted. So those things, and it's not a lot of money necessarily for some things, but sometimes you still want to have those conversations to make sure that everybody feels included, or at least has an understanding of why the budget is the way it is. And then another one on programs. It's not about building power for communities of color, but looking more at designing and building shared power, designed to help people analyze and address root causes, program planning, opportunities to move forward. And that's kind of where we are. It's like we want to keep building our anti-racist knowledge base and practice every time we do a project. It is never going to be an endpoint for that, but something that we can continuously build upon. One of the resources I wanted to kind of share, which I think it would be interesting for people, and I've used this a lot when I've done trainings with colleges, is a power map. It's kind of really fun and colorful. It's like, oh, who has the level of power and who's opposed opposition, and you could pick an issue. It doesn't have to be, it could be something around, not just around race, but who makes decisions about who gets to not do homework. It could be something about who gets access to participate in something. It could be anything. So it's really looking at how do people map. And one of the things I like to ask people to do is, if you want to really find out how somebody feels about a project or an organization, give them this blank map and let them start mapping who are the players, who are the stakeholders they see, and their level of power. That can inform you a lot on what work you might need to do. Maybe there are people on this that are identified by youth that you are like, who's this person who you see as someone who has great influence for you in this, area, or this organization or this small business. Sometimes we don't know, as institutional entities, organization entities, who the youth find as people who really are influencing them on the day-to-day or outside of our scope of knowledge. And so I really want to encourage people to kind of use this map. It's kind of fun. I've done it with adults and I've done it with youth. And it is amazing when you put them, then you kind of tack them all up. Of course, we can't do that virtually, but you can kind of, if you gather them and you do your own kind of bulletin board PDF of them, it is amazing to see what people's differences are in the same community, in the same classroom around those power issues. So the last part is really about that performing. When I say perform, I mean that means we are performing the work of anti-racism and not performative. Performative is about a philosophy of like, we're going to be anti-racist, or I believe in anti-racism. That's performative, but it has no real worth and value to be performative. We need to perform. We need to do the things we can to take those actions and to continue to perform to make anti-racist work embedded. One of the rubrics I love, and this is just, they actually have this chart all the way to like a 6-year plan. I wanted to show you just the short-term goals for progress toward racial equity, with organizations. And here again, we have talking about dialogues, which I think are a wonderful way to start things. And it's, it's kind of like doing those open reflections, but in a very specific way. But we can do dialogues at the beginning, we could do dialogues at the end to keep informing us. The other is storytelling. So we talk about demonstration and celebration. We want our anti-racist practices to make sure that the story and the voices of everyone is actually part of the bigger picture. Oftentimes, I see wonderful work being done in those kind of like, okay, we're all going to be able to present. Everybody gets to present, but then when the story comes out, it's usually just the organization's voice and not necessarily the voice of everyone who's participated in the stakeholders. And I think one of the things that we can definitely improve on even really quickly is allowing unfiltered voices to be told in those stories moving forward about the project. And so I do have a link to a wonderful tool that I liked. It's around telling a new story, a collaborative checklist for social justice leaders using narrative strategies for changes is a nice big title, but they have 5 tenets that are important. First, do no harm, critique government without undermining democracy. And I think that's another thing around anti-racism work, is that we have to be okay with critique. And we have to be able to listen to and be okay that sometimes we're going to be critiqued, not only as government, but as organizations, as people. But that doesn't mean that we are stuck in the place where the critique landed. We can move forward. We can use that critique to advance our anti-racism work, support lasting change, prioritize strategy, collaboration over expediency. And that's really hard because oftentimes we're like, we've got deadlines, let's get this done. And this work, anti-racism work, and I think oftentimes becomes the biggest challenge, is that your time clock is often different than those who are most impacted by racism in this country. And so we, and sometimes it's the flip, it's like, especially youth today are like, we want changes right now. And organizations like, well, we have to do this first. So I think part of this, one of the things I love about this strategy is really talking about that approach of like, how are we prioritizing strategy and collaboration, and coming to a place we can agree that we're moving at a pace that is purposeful and with intention. And then the fourth part is considering context, history, and landscape, and we've talked a little bit about that. But the last part I want to talk a little bit about is the question of attribution, giving credit where credit is due. And so one of the things when we're talking about those stories of what the project has been, how it has turned out, we cannot leave out our partners in that conversation, no matter how small you might feel that they were in that, but really kind of be intentional about having their story as really embedded into the overall picture. So they have this checklist and some tips I wanted to highlight here. You'll be able to see it through the document in the link, but have partners at the table contributed to led successful impacts or benchmarks. Look at highlighting the work through social media. And I think that's stuff that can be done throughout the process of the project and partnership, is if you get in the habit from the beginning to say, here's what we're doing, but not only to say, here's what we're doing, but sometimes, and I've been seeing this is where it's a social media takeover. And if you have that ability to let your partners do a social media takeover of part of the project, then I highly recommend it. That is a very amazing and powerful way to shift power structures, especially around in anti-racism work. That's one of my favorite ones. Giving attributions we talked about. And then there's a few tips here that they put as well. So we have a few minutes left. And so one of the things is, if you were able to read the Avoiding Racial Equity Detours, I wanted to give you time to do some reflection. We're going to do probably some kind of more, it's an online reflection tool. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Padlet. It's my favorite. Can you see that screen now? The Padlet screen? If not, I'm going to try to share this with you. But this is something, let me see if I can get the link for you. I'm going to share the link. And if you go to the link, you will be able to, you don't have to register or anything. But you can actually give your feedback, and this is all anonymous, on some of these questions. And a little bit is the reflection of the Gorski article. And if you haven't had a chance to read it, you don't have to answer the question, but there's a few things I want to know, and I know this could also help inform YSA and the work of doing anti-racism work moving forward, is, you know, which ways would you like more support or resources for a deeper dive to embed anti-racist service work? Do you feel you have the support of other stakeholders to actualize anti-racist work? Do you have a success story or resource? And I know somebody shared a resource earlier that you could share to help others, and you can share it there if possible. So I want to give people a chance to do this reflection for the last few minutes. It will remain open even after this. We would love your feedback, because this helps us kind of go, and I say us, even though I'm not with YSA, but I know it's going to help YSA in terms of what they are really committed to do. And if there's something that you find like is very specific, even for your own personal situation, that you want to do, then let's hopefully we can talk about making a more substantive training for the future moving forward. So as we let everybody do that, and we will, I'm going to stop sharing the screen, but you're going to be able to work on that doc. That will remain open. I don't close that. And I just want to say thank you. I know our time went fast today, but hopefully it'll give you a little bit of some thought pieces to move forward as you're doing your MLK Day of Service, but also other service projects in the future.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tavita. We really appreciate it. So one thing we want to really emphasize, obviously we've talked about our conversation today. We really want you to consider the entirety of the conversation today, the article that we had sent out prior to today's webinar, and a number of the strategies that Tavita had spoken about. Think about how these strategies can be applied to your MLK Day of Service projects. We know MLK Day is coming up in just over a month. So obviously, while we really, really encourage you to implement these strategies, we know that might not be completely feasible, but again, we really encourage you to keep that in mind. And if you are able to implement strategies, please do so. What we'll be doing as part of our next Youth Service Institute, which will be in February, we'll come back to this conversation, do a reflection, and then talk about next steps, how we can implement this in further programming, how we can make it sustainable, and really create that culture at our respective organizations or schools. Karen, Mike, anything that you would like to add as well?
Just another big thank you to Tavita and to the Allstate Foundation for their support. And it's been a great conversation on what is a very cold, rainy, and snowy day here where we are, and lots of good food for thought. So thank you so much.
And then just kind of looking forward to the future. Again, I will be sharing out the recording of this as well as the deck from Tavita in the coming days. I'll make sure to include the resources that a number of you have mentioned in the chat as well. And I'll hang out for a little bit longer if anyone does have any questions. But other than that, if we don't talk to you between now and roughly this time next week, we hope you all have a wonderful Christmas, happy holiday, and hopefully 2021 will be slightly better than 2020 has been for all of our sakes.
I'll stay on too, Katie.
Wonderful. Thanks, Tavita.
So Tavita, just to go back to my question with regards to how do you use some of these tools in the actual planning process? I am sharing in the that format that you just put out there on the Padlet, Padlet.
A Padlet, yeah.
We did a workshop a couple of years ago, 3 times in a row, with youth on global awareness. And one of the students had been adopted from India. She and her brother were both adopted from India, not biological siblings, but adopted from India. And 2 teens had traveled to India. So they came back in rural Montana to bring forward this idea of, here's what you think of East Indians, here's the reality from our experience. And they used food, they used dress, and they used entertainment. It was incredibly impactful. It started with a teacher really not knowing, frankly, what these students were going to do. And I ran it very much in the fashion of YSA and said, students, what would you like to do? So that was very positive. The second year that it was run, the teacher then did know what was going to be presented and was pretty open to the whole process. The third year, new teacher came on board and also was supportive of the process, but was surprised at some of the outcome. The fourth year, it didn't happen. And the fifth year, the younger sibling of the girl who'd been adopted, and again, he had been adopted from India as well, committed suicide. So Montana, as you know, has a huge issue with a challenge with suicide. And one of the things that happens in rural settings is this whole, we are primarily white, Caucasian, European descent, male. When you do that chart of the power and authority, that's very interesting, especially on the budget item that you had, is really male dominated. Men make the decisions in many of these organizations. So bringing youth forward to make those decisions is empowering. How do you, and our approach in that global studies, we were given a lot of leeway because nobody knew what we were doing. They didn't know India. They didn't know what was going to be presented. And so it was kind of like, okay, go for it. On many other projects, when you bring youth in, there is this, we as the adult community know what is best mantra. And because of the very conservative European influence in much of Montana, despite the Native American indigenous population, what can we do? What suggestions would you have in terms of bringing in a greater discussion? Much of our ethnicity is hidden. We actually have a significant, we work with a lot of students who are Native American and they won't identify as such. Much like the disability platform. And on the disability platform, we've actually had a lot of success, partly because we have a lot of members of our board and our coaches who are disabled, so we can go through that identification process with them, saying, this is a positive thing, not a negative thing. How do you champion around the fact that you're different and how much you bring to this world as different, et cetera. On the ethnicity side of it, it is much more hidden and much more protected.
Right.
What suggestions would you have in particular in that? And Katie, maybe you too, and Karen on that, being at the national level.
What about organizations that are indigenous based? What are your partnerships with them?
So what's been interesting on that front is because we are in the area of, we actually have an NIH, National Institute of Health facility located here. And because of that, a lot of their educational focus is on the Native American tribal side. And so like Salish Kootenai College and some of these tribal colleges, we've been working with them. The reverse happens in those settings. Then there's the inclusive piece of programming only for Native American children. And so the crossover doesn't, it's not allowed to happen as often. So if that makes sense. So in other words,
no, it does, but this is still NIH we're talking about. It's not an Indigenous-led organization.
Yes, the grant funding comes into these tribal colleges, and so then
Okay,
our work
I
with
understand.
working
Okay.
with the tribal colleges in that regard. However, I will tell you, across the board, I'm trying to think if there's an exception to this. There's always one. In the last 3 years, all of those organizations that we're dealing with, while their audience is Indigenous,
Mhm.
the people making the decisions are not. And
Yeah.
and our advocacy is always, okay, we're just turning this over to the kids. We're going to let them do it, which then brings in this diverse, but there's a lot of protection around that.
Well, there's a whole process when we're talking about like youth participatory action, where we want to make sure that we give youth voice and that ability to lead without burdening them with
That is the word that's been used. Wendy, don't go out and ask the students to do this because they're so overwhelmed they can't do it. And on the flip side, you get the youth going, excuse me, I want to.
and they're not burdened because they're wanting to. So that's the voice you have to listen to, which is great.
Mhm.
And then also it's again a process, because even though they might want to, they might get to a point within the process that it is too much,
Mhm.
and they need a bigger net of support than what they had originally assessed and what you might have originally assessed. And that's where it's like kind of broadening those stakeholder partnerships it's going to be really important. And I'm not as familiar with Montana Indigenous tribal leadership, but there, even if it's not directly in your community, that you might find something, look beyond as far as you can, start broadening that that regional geographic net, because it's so important. And even if it's something that is not frequent, the students will find that if they have even see that somebody is actually making the effort to have them connected to Indigenous adult leaders who could be mentors, who could be supports, it's going to also help broaden the scope of the work that can be done, and also that anti-racist approach. Sometimes you're right. I was in Virginia for 2.5 years, and there were definitely most of the time not people in that community specifically who could be the support. I somehow I ended up being the support for students that weren't even my students, because I was there. So I started then connecting them with people maybe 2 hours away, but now we're in a virtual space. We've got a lot more. This is an opportunity.
Right. And that's one of the things that's nice, Katie, to have you kind of mention as we go into the next year, while I really find doing Zoom presentations and whatnot, I just feel like I'm staring at this box. It just about drives me crazy. It has allowed, in the meeting that I had at noon with National Honor Society, I had students across the state. That would not have happened otherwise.
Exactly. Oh,
and
yes.
So, sometimes it's nice on that platform to get it. But yeah, I'll look at the other resources that you put out there, but any suggestions you have on that, send them our way. Or I struggle with that, because I think my father was a cultural anthropologist, and we also lived in India. And so this whole idea of participatory observation was part of it. And so when we brought the Indian visual images into the classroom, there was a lot of pushback on some of the items, the dress, where we wore full burqas, and just had a lot of those discussions. But it was so positive afterwards.
Mhm.
And yet, as I recognize in reflection, much of that happened because there was a willingness to let the students proceed without
Right.
really knowing what they were exactly doing. It's, oh, they're going to give a presentation on India. Okay. You know, kind of a process. Didn't realize it was going to be all day and have interactions, and kids were going to dress up in the outfits and the whole thing. But I'd like to do much more of that. I really like the whole, you know, chart that you had about talking about this at every single level. It's so critical now. So
Right.
I appreciate you bringing that into that whole planning and that whole, you know, every piece, feed it in. Really appreciate that.
I'm glad that helped. And I definitely, yeah, there's so much to deep dive with that. So, you know, I know I can share what I possibly can, but this also will help inform YSA about things that might be future, you know, aspects to kind of focus on for the work. I want to give, I think Amanda also had, if you don't mind, Wendy, I'm going to let Amanda talk. She had her hand up.
I was just going to respond to Wendy, just because I work for the state. Well, I'm a teacher, but I also work for the state of California on curriculum, and a way that we've engaged students in a safe way, a safe space for them to step out. We've engaged a lot. We have a recent sick community in our area, and nobody, you know, we're having more and more of these students, and nobody knew. They were calling them Sikhs, and they're like, it's sick, and nobody knew what it was. And parents were coming in, and just customs wise, and we had a lot of frustration, and most of it was cultural misunderstanding. And so what we did was we reached out to the local Sikh community, and we said, you know, we have a lot of your students, we're having, you know, just kind of a disconnect, and it's a cultural misunderstanding. And so we actually held, it was a 3-night information thing for teachers to come to. And the Sikh community was so great. They brought dinner. They brought, you know, their kids got a chance to dress up in traditional wear. A lot of the kids were dancers and things that they did in an extracurricular way. And just kind of bringing up, when you teach this activity, do you include this group? So if you're teaching a war, if you're teaching, this is something you already teach, do you mention this? And just by mentioning somebody who looks like me, I'm going to pay attention more. And somebody who dresses like me, has a name that sounds like mine, has a surname like mine. And, you know, we got more support than we would have ever imagined. You know, they said, oh, can we bring some food? We thought they were going to bring like cookies. They brought a full dinner. And so we, you know, we were there far past when we were supposed to be, but I think the most impactful thing was the kids created and sat on a panel of what I wish my teacher knew about me, and answered questions from the teacher community. They did a little presentation, and they were ages, the youngest one was 10, the oldest one was in early 20s. So I'd been through the high school system. And, you know, what you like, is my mom going to talk first? Is my dad going to talk first? When I'm a parent, this is how I'm going to be dressed. When I come in, I'm not going to shake your hand. That's not part of my culture, you know, stuff like that. And just, you know, if this is happening in class, some of it's holidays, fasting holidays, you know, and just general safe space for kids to, I think, just as educators, you wouldn't be there if you didn't care. And you're going to be a very kind audience for what could be a controversial topic. And, you know, for people to not be defensive, to already come with the mindset that they're going to learn something new and probably try something new. It gives the kids confidence to do it again in a school setting where kids are going to judge kids, and it's a little bit more unstructured. And you don't necessarily know what your audience was, but we have it every year. And actually we hold it during a very kind of controversial time. We hold it during 9/11. So the Sikh story of the turban, you know, we had, and I took the phone calls because, you know, we had a whole thing about, you know, wearing turbans and what the turban means and the different colors. And, you know, somebody was like, well, can I wear one? And they were like, sure, let's do it, you know, and it was just that kids really want to know, and people really want to talk. And I just thought it was so positive. But those different groups, we do it with, you know, different groups of parents. So we have a group of Korean parents that thought it was a great idea and wanted to do it. And just kind of, you know, we have Vietnamese parents, and we're very diverse in Southern California. So, but it's just that you recognized us, you saw me, there's something changing. And something I put in the chat was the kids are moving to, it's a kid led, it's called Diversify Our Narrative. And it's a nationwide project to diversify the books that kids read in English. And so what we're doing is we're doing a read in, and that kids can't advocate for a book they haven't read. Otherwise, it's just an adult giving them another another list of books saying, you should be reading these, not these. Well, you don't have a powerful voice if you haven't read the book and you haven't talked about it in an academic way when you didn't have to. And so that's kind of how we're starting to address that and letting the kids have choice. And just from an academic perspective, if you want help putting it together, this is what I do. I'll be more than that. I guarantee you I probably put together the program in fact, I put together a Native American program that I can actually send you.
I would love that. I would love that. I'll put in the chat I know my email's out there somewhere, but I'll put it in the chat down here too.
Katie can give you my contact information, but we have it's a throwback to the turn of the century school. We have a Sherman Indian boarding school in our city. It's about 2 miles away. And actually we invited them in, and they brought all the dancers and the kids, and it was really fun. It was really cool. I think you would enjoy it, and it's a great way to address some of those issues that you're talking about in a safe control.
That's great, Amanda. That's great.
Yep.
Where are you in Southern Cal?
I'm in Riverside, which is about 30 minutes away from Disneyland.
I lived in San Diego for 30 years, so
okay.
or 20 years.
We're about 15 minutes
I know
away
where you are. Yeah. So one of the things I do want to caution, because although it is a great way to help people who are not knowledgeable about different groups and ethnicities, that we don't want that to be the thing. The only thing is oh, they're going to come dressed, they're going to come and do stories. Or we want to make sure that we move beyond that afterwards. It's like, okay, we're going to do this, and now what? How does that change policy? How does that change practices? So it's just, you're right, it's a place to start, and we want to make sure it comes from that community. So it's great. It's like, I've been in places where the students, like you're talking about, are like, yeah, we want to do this. And then I've come to places like, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to stand out. I want them to see me as me, and not necessarily just because of my cultural heritage. And oftentimes, especially if, we're talking about communities of color who've been in the United States for generation after generation. So we have to definitely weigh a lot of things. I love those ideas and those events, but we also have to make sure it's not becomes the template for even sometimes not even the beginning of the work. It may not be part of the work. It may be, never the part of the work, or it might be the only thing, but we don't want it to be the only thing. We want it to progress. So those are really great things. And, and I did a lot of work in California on critical pedagogy, which is actually my specialty. So I love, the idea of the book project, but how do you do that not only, for books, but how do you embed it into curriculum? And that's a whole nother training and a whole nother world, but it's those are important things, those steps that you make towards that equity.
Thank you very much for both of you guys sharing. And yes, Amanda, I did put in the chat my contact information. I'd love to sideline and have continual conversations. And Travita, I am trying to already think about how we can get you to do a training in our state. So I'm going to think about that for January's grant writing efforts and things, because I think, sometimes you have organizations outside of Montana come in and they can just have a different impactful voice. And, you have to start the seed somewhere, but unfortunately our entire state is all individual. Each individual school district sets their own policies and procedures. We're not state administered.
Right.
So it's a little challenging on some of those larger fronts, but every little drop helps. So yeah, let me think about that a little bit more. So again, really appreciate it. And Amanda will, any of those things on the book front, those kinds of things would be wonderfully shared. Thank you. Thank you.
Does anybody else have any questions?
If you have time, I don't know, it's kind of a question. I'll try to form it into a question. So our difficulty, our struggle that we're having here is that, so we did not, here is, sorry, Lawrence, Kansas. So I'm at the United Way of Douglas County.
Thank you.
And so we did not have an existing youth coalition before. So this planning for MLK Day is our first thing that we're doing with them, which is tricky. And we're on Zoom, and we've had people coming back each week to our meetings, and there's about 4 or 5 core youth that show up, and they're great and they have awesome ideas. And the struggle is that one of the 3 ideas they've come up with is focused around like what I would say would be a theme that's easy to tie anti-racism into. They're wanting to do a photo contest around, I think the theme they picked was, what does Black Lives Matter mean to me? And have youth submit photos and then display historical protest photos and also photos of protests from this past year that we had. And that one is like very easy to see how it ties in. Some of the other ones that they've had are more, the issue that they really brought forward was feeling like mental health was struggling a lot. Like they're hearing from their peers, they're worried about the elders in the community, and they're worried about like the really young kids who just don't have that connection outside of their parents and outside of the classroom with like older youth to kind of have those formative relationships. So we're going forward with all their ideas, and it's trying to think about, so one of the things we've turned kind of the relationship building or combating mental health into is potentially building like mental health first aid kits and distributing those. And another one is a letter writing campaign where people just like write letters of caring. But I don't want to make anything like too generic or too, I want things to stay focused and to stay targeted while also respecting that like mental health is what you guys are worried about right now. So I guess any input on steering them without overriding their ideas or.
No, I think here's what's very interesting is that I'm working with a group of students from Brandeis University who have just gotten funding to work on a mental health in the Black community project. And so they are actually looking at first kind of finding out what are perceptions of mental health, in the Black community specifically, but that could be for your group. What does it mean to different ethnicities, and then who do they go to when they feel a certain way, or would they go to a doctor, would they go to this? And then they are offering or kind of having workshops, or I don't even know if I should say workshops, but more like webinars with different aspects of mental health in the Black community. So some are spiritual healers, and some are around religion and talking about mental health. Some are talking from the very clinical perspective. Some are talking about nutrition and that's role through mental health. So it's definitely possible to kind of take that project and say, well, how do people feel about mental health? I mean, we're watching right now with COVID and the vaccine that this is not an issue of just about COVID and a vaccine. It's also some really bringing up, you know, historical context of the medical community, not just historical, because I want people to know that it's not just history we're talking about even daily practices today in medicine that are impeding the trust of the Black community, Latin community, Native American community from getting the vaccine.
Yeah.
I know more people, and it doesn't matter what their education level, economic level, or whatever, who are people of color who are not taking that vaccine, any vaccine, until they see what the impacts are going to be.
Yeah.
And so, you know, we've got the same with the mental health aspect. There's different stigmas. What does that mean, you know, to them? So that's one way I would kind of suggest, is kind of helping them frame, like kind of go, oh yeah, and how do different communities think about mental health? How do different communities address mental health issues? You know, so that's one way I would suggest.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful.
Anybody else have some questions? And then what can they do? Yep. Yeah. And they may not change the narrative per se. So the Brandeis students are talking about what can be the breadth and scope too of the narrative, like adding to the narrative of like, oh yeah, it's you know, there is, you know, that whole idea of, you know, we may not have people in the Black community specifically who will say, oh, I have mental health issues. Or they might just say, you know, I feel bad, I feel sad, you know, and then to really talk about too, you know, and also one of the things we're talking about with the Brandeis students, and this is a multiracial group that's working on this project at Brandeis. We're talking about the historical context of mental health and for the Black community, and or just, you know, why aren't we ever in this country talking about racism as how the historical racism impacting and the generational trauma of racism and how that impacts mental health. And so they're really talking about that as well. And so oftentimes mental health is also looking at, like, when we're talking about, and man, I love how you're talking about changing the narrative, because the narrative might be, let's stop talking about mental health as something that's only a personal issue, like it's your problem, but we've got a system that has contributed to mental health problems as well. So absolutely. So it's about whatever they can. Go ahead, Amanda, you were gonna.
I was just gonna say from a little bit younger perspective is, and I think you were talking about the generational trauma of how parents respond when teenagers say that they think they have depression or any of these things. There's either the suck it up mentality, because I was fine, so you're fine, or they break down in tears and think their kid's going to kill themselves today. And because that could have happened as well. And so just kind of saying, you know, I'm going to say this out loud, and, you know, their teachers react differently because we have a different narrative. We have a different narrative that we grew up with. So when you tell me I'm a psych major, I'm going to say, are you okay? I'm not going to break down into tears. I come from a completely different background and place, and I haven't lived the life that you've lived, but kids also don't know the trauma of their parents often, whether they're boat people or whatever it is. And so just kind of, that's what I was kind of getting at, is changing the narrative, even understanding your family dynamic and your family narrative first, before we can look at, you know, changing the narrative in your house, before you can look at the larger community. So is your house representative of the community, or are you an anomaly? And kind of going, well, where did this come from? What experiences did you have? And then also for our multi-generational homes with grandmothers and grandfathers are living in the home, have an entirely different outlook as well. So that's just, you know, just because kids will tell me before they tell their parents, and they'll tell me on Zoom or anything. So us as teachers are going, I don't know what to do now. But those are the conversations we're having, and then having to tell the parent and everything is really hard. And those different reactions. So but kids are all in. They love talking about it, and they want to know that next step. So if you're looking for passion, there's a lot of passion around mental health right now.
Yes. And on that very note, we've all got this collective, pandemic that is impacting mental health and some communities in different ways. And we haven't even begun to see the wave that's going to hit us around this. We've seen some, it's, holidays definitely bring out a lot of things now, but we've even post-pandemic, as people start kind of re-entering, we're going to definitely see a lot more. So that's also another aspect you might want to make sure you help them build in.
All right. Did anyone have anything else? I know Jillian and Walter are on, but they're kind of hidden on my screen as well.
Tavita, I just wanted to ask, where are you located now if you were in San Diego?
I'm in DC now.
Oh.
Yes, I went from 30 years in California, 2.5 years in southern rural Virginia, and now I'm home.
All right, I'm gonna head off. Thank you. I appreciate you staying after.
Thanks so much for your questions.
So good to see you.
Good to
Thanks,
see you guys.
Jocelyn.